but I think that you all have served us and the citizens well. So I appreciate your hard work. So at this time, if we could look over the minutes from last meeting, and if you're comfortable, we'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
The minutes were sent out previously, so I think we had a chance to review them. So I would make a motion that we approve the meetings as were submitted, meeting minutes as were submitted.
Thank you, Representative Garrett. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Chief, Sheriff. Any discussion on the motion? All those who in favor, show of hands for approval. Opposers, there are none, and motion carries. Now we will look for item number 2, review and vote on the training recommendations. I know that we had previous discussion, and I'm not sure, can you all put some of the notes from the training recommendations on board so that we can discuss those areas? And I know Representative Gallard, as we had our co-chair or our chair conversation, we had a meeting and we talked about that there were some things that we highlighted in each group. We brought up and had pretty extensive conversation about the recommendation about physical and mental health recommendations. So I guess I kind of wanted to refresh us on that. Sheriff, I know you were tied up last meeting, so maybe Ms. Leslie can pick up and we can talk about that a little bit. Hey, Chief, good morning.
Hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning. My apologies for being late.
No problem.
Mayor, are we on number 2 of the agenda?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I thought you were on. So yes, we're on item number 2, to review and vote on training recommendations. And I know we wanted to kind of make sure that we were all on the same page so that we could get something to push forward to the overall task force.
Okay. I should be sharing the recommendation screen. Do y'all see that?
Yes.
And so these were the recommendations, and we talked through them last time with Chief Davis and Representative Galliard. Mayor Colvin had to leave, and I had gotten some feedback from, on behalf of Sheriff Ingram with respect to these, which I tried to raise at every discussion point that we were talking about them. And so I think that what we need to do this morning then, Mayor Colvin, is to get everyone's vote on these so that they can go to the full task force.
Okay.
Or any edits that need to happen before the vote.
All right. Are we able to make that any larger? Let's just be.
I can try. Let's see. How about that?
All right.
And so these have not changed since the last time I sent them out before the previous meeting.
Mhm.
And they were changed in response to the ongoing edits, I think, as reflected in the document title, to reflect the edits by Chief Davis and Representative Galliard. And I sent these out as part of the pre-work also in this current format. So I have not made any changes since I sent them out to you in the pre-work.
Okay. Group, did we have any discussion or anything we'd like to talk about pertaining to this these recommendations on law enforcement training? So if there are no issues, like to see if we could have a motion to approve these to move forward to the overall task force.
And Mayor Colvin, do you want to take them one by one, or do you want me to just scroll through all of them, however you want to handle it?
Well, whatever the pleasure of the group. I know we've seen them, but yeah, let's just yeah, we'll go over them one by one, sure. So any items or edits or changes to recommendation number 1? Okay. All right, we'll move. All right, recommendation number 2, recommend changes to the current mandatory in-service training topics.
And Mayor, I'll just let you know that a couple of things that we did not settle were the frequency of when we wanted to recommend some of these, or whether we wanted them to go to the full task force without a frequency, and it to be worked out later by the working group who's going to work with the Joint In-Service Training Committee.
Okay, and also group, we during the meeting of the chairs, we acknowledged the fact that we may send a recommendation that the fine points or some of the details are not worked out, and we'll leave that discussion to the larger group. And so this could be an example of that we're recommending that implicit bias and racial equity training occur, for instance, but the frequency, maybe we don't have a good hold on what the frequency is, and we may want to hear input from the other task force members. But that is certainly okay to adopt it in theory and to send it in for specifics. Any input from you guys or any thought on that?
I just add that, when you think in terms of the in-service calendar or the BLET calendar, if you have a student that graduates from BLET and say, for instance, the larger group says that the frequency is every other year, there's a possibility that a new recruit may not receive this type of training until their second year of being on a department, unless we add in here at some point, and it could be in the BLET section. And I think the BLET does have a racial equity training component in it. Leslie, do you know whether or not there's one or not? I can't remember.
I don't know that there's one in so many words. I think that my understanding is that the Justice Academy has worked that into the beginning part with communication skills and problem solving. Okay. I think that's something that we could put in under recommendation 1 here if we wanted to, make suggestions about reviewing BLET to ensure certain things. We wrote here that we're ensuring ethical issues as appropriate, and then creating emotional intelligence, including practical applications. But we could add something about racial equity training here if we wanted to.
I think that would fix it. And, those new recruits wouldn't get lost, from that training, because I can see where a chief would say, for my entire department, every other year we have a refresher on racial equity training, and not have to worry about the recruits because they'll have it in their basic training.
Does that solve it, Chief?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Anything else on there, Sheriff Ingram? You see anything? You all have the law enforcement professional eyes. That helps me, certainly.
No, sir. I agree with the chief on that.
Representative Gallup, you see anything?
No, I'm good. We kind of went through this in pretty good detail at the last meeting. I'm pretty comfortable with how Leslie's captured everything.
Okay, all right. We'll move on to section 3, or recommendation number 3. Law enforcement agencies should conduct internal training every year to ensure that officers understand the consequences of policy violations. I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
And part of the conversation last time was that this could be possibly a resource strain on agencies. And so we wanted to, the implementation strategy was designed to account for that, surveying to see what is currently in place, working with the accreditation committee to make sure that it's embedded in the accreditation standards, and then determining whether it's appropriate to do a certain amount of hours on top of that. I don't know if there's anything else we need to add to that point.
Okay.
Mayor,
Yes, sir.
I want us to also, and you may have had a lengthy conversation about this, and I apologize that I was not able to be a part of that initially. But I want us to be very careful about, the problem statement, the culture of policing must change. We must move from a warrior mindset to a guardian mindset. Well, I support the guardian mindset wholeheartedly. I think that in some respects, the warrior mindset that they're talking about is being taken out of context with regards to officers getting into altercations where they're fighting for their life, and that mentality their training that they go back to on how to survive an encounter like that. And I want to be sure that we are careful about the words we use with regards to this. And again, it's two different contexts we're talking about. While I support being guardians of our respective jurisdictions and the people, I don't really think that we need to include the word warrior mindset in this suggestion at all. The guardian mindset, an emphasis on that, I think would accomplish that. But at the same time, there's training that we provide our officers and that we need to continue to provide our officers that it enables them to survive encounters that if they didn't have it, they more than likely wouldn't. And we need to be very careful when it comes to that.
So good point, Sheriff. So basically, the revision just said that ensuring that officers have a guardian mindset is critical to 21st century policing, and without mentioning the warrior mindset at all is what you're saying, right?
Yes, sir. And it still allows for those tactics and training to be utilized and a focus on those areas. But I wholeheartedly agree with the overall concept of being guardians and a shift to that. I just think leaving warrior out would be much more effective with this, in my opinion.
Does this revision accomplish that, Sheriff Ingram?
Yes, it does.
I would agree with the sheriff as well, because while I know, and I think he knows what the original intent was for using that language, it has been misinterpreted by far in law enforcement as to mean that we don't want officers to be in the mindset of survival sometimes. And in order to be in the mindset of survival, you have to be a warrior in order to get through certain types of critical situations and fights and altercations. And I think officers that aren't on our level to really decipher what the intent was, I think it left the wrong impression with a lot of law enforcement officers as to what that warrior terminology meant. So I think we can still accomplish that guardian piece and leave the warrior aspect. I think this particular recommendation will be embraced, better with that language that way.
Okay.
I do too.
That's why we need the professional law enforcement input on that, just to make sure that it's something that can be appreciated and adopted by law enforcement themselves and the agencies. Okay, anything Representative Galliard you want to add, take away?
No, I'm good with this discussion.
All right, keep moving. All right, consider a requirement that all law enforcement officers maintain physical fitness standards. This came up during the chair's meeting, and Secretary Hooks kind of stated that he thought this could potentially be problematic in some respects. What do you all think about that?
I think it can be very problematic. And we had short conversation last week about this, and Sheriff, just for your edification, you know, my position is, you know, existing police departments, how do you edge your people into a certain requirement, a weight requirement, and so on. I think you can probably have a philosophy in a police department of good health and officer wellness and embrace that, but to set up a program that some people, even through medical restrictions, may not be able to comply with. I think it might be too much or too heavy a lift for all agencies to embrace physical fitness standards like the military does. Of course, they have the resources in order to do that. But your thoughts, Sheriff? I don't know.
I agree with you, Chief. It would be very problematic, and you know, there are certain areas in law enforcement that require our officers to be in better physical condition than other areas, and that could create a tremendous shortage of law enforcement personnel serving us, and make it very difficult to help people progress through their careers in law enforcement. And even with the military, with the standards they have, you can still see how as their time progresses in the military, those standards are not as the equivalent to the initial standards. So I think with, you know, a lot of stuff that we're trying to accomplish, I don't see this one being one that we should really try to push forward because it's not going to help add value to what we're trying to accomplish overall with this task.
I agree. And I also think there may be some ADA issues that that might have to be dealt with. You know, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are a lot of protections for employees, and there's so many different situations and conditions that officers deal with on a day-to-day basis. But does it prevent them from fulfilling essential job functions? I've got officers that have a lot of physical issues, but they can still go out and fulfill, you know, their essential job functions because there's so many different aspects of our work. So this might be one that might be easier said than done.
So what do you guys think about the mental aspect that Representative Galliard talked about? How can you, I understand that you can encourage people by giving additional break time for them to go to the gym and work out. You know, you're encouraging or incentivizing them to physically be better. What about mental? What do you do to check in and to help the officers cope with stressors and problems from a mental standpoint?
Well, not to jump ahead of you, Chief, but you know, one thing that we utilize, being an accredited agency, we had implemented the early warning system, and that plays right into the mental health of our officers, where we have officers that may be an outstanding officer, very consistent, and then we see a change where there's a 2 or 3 uses of force in an area, or just different things that will trigger this system, and it will require attention from people that are supervising that particular officer in different levels, different layers. And that way it allows us to address that early on before it becomes a real issue. And it plays into the mental health of our officers because, you know, our officers are human. We all know this. They have things that may be occurring in their personal life that they would be bringing to work with them, affecting their ability to do their job effectively. And this, you know, this plays into what we are trying to encourage with the use of early warning systems. So I think we could accomplish that, but not necessarily under this particular recommendation as it's written.
So what you just described, Sheriff, was kind of a reaction to someone who you may see some signs of a problem. What do you guys think you could have that provided some preventative mental steps to relieve stressors before it becomes a problem?
So I think we've sort of touched on a few things, you know, just incentivizing workout, you know, plans or times for officers to be able to utilize, you know, physical fitness, you know, incentives. We have physical fitness incentives here. Officers can work out 45 minutes a day, you know, while they're at work, if they see an open opportunity. I don't know how feasible that is for other agencies that may have a small number of officers that they can't afford for officers to take an hour in addition to their lunch hour, you know, to work out. But it has been a huge benefit to try to encourage an environment of health and wellness. The sheriff hit on a key aspect of monitoring employee mental fitness by early warning systems. And I think that might need to be the recommendation as opposed to maintain certain physical fitness standards. Maybe, you know, recommending that agencies have a early warning program, which most agencies have a general order or standard operating procedures that guide, you know, what supervisors are supposed to do when they see these certain signs. And to your point, Mayor Colvin, some of it is preventive, to be able to prevent problems because we're paying attention. We've trained our supervisors on what early warning is and what they are required to do when they see these signs. So, I think it's important. It's just I think it might need to be easier for the agency to be able to embrace. And some of the best practices are you know, outlining an accreditation and accreditation standards with early warning and also peer support programs.
So if I may, as y'all probably noticed in the pre-work, one of the things to go over is our recommendations from Work Group 2 that we are supposed to support. And one of those is the early warning system recommendation. So that is on the list of what we will consider. They've already drafted a recommendation in their working group. And so now they've passed it to us to take a look at before they've voted on it.
Good.
Okay, Representative Gallup, you had anything on that?
I'm a little disappointed that we're, I think this is a hard sell to the public because I think how it will be perceived is we're making a couple of statements. I think when we don't have this kind of requirement, I think from a public perspective, we're making the statement that the physical ability required to become a law enforcement officer is not necessary to continue being a law enforcement officer. And I don't know that we want to present that perception, because I think it will be a perception. And then I think the second thing we're saying to the community is that physical and mental health is really a non-factor in how law enforcement handles stressful situations. And I don't know that we can sell that. I mean, I don't know of any person who does their job equally well when they're physically or mentally struggling. I don't know of any, it doesn't matter what the profession is. So to exempt law enforcement, to say, you really don't have to be in great physical and mental condition, we're going to lower the bar because we're really concerned that our officers won't clear the bar. So let's lower it so that, and I think that's going to be the perception. And I just am, and I understand the position of the chief and the sheriff. I just, from a user perspective, because I think from what I'm hearing, much of their conversation is from an internal law enforcement kind of gatekeeper of guardians of law enforcement. I'm speaking from a consumer public perspective. And I have probably 200, I probably have 75 to 80 law enforcement officers in my congregation. I could poll any of them right now and say, on a stressful day, a day that you're not physically well, this is your situation. Will you always handle it at the same time? I can probably tell you 90% of law enforcement is going to say, how I handle something very much depends on what's going on with me physically and mentally. So for us to kind of take it off the table, I just don't personally feel comfortable with that decision. It doesn't feel like we're really protecting the public when we do that. So.
And maybe I was misunderstood, Representative Guy. I don't mean take it off the table, because there are physical requirements for our officers, and we have had to, unfortunately, when officers can't meet physical standards, they can no longer be a police officer. I think what I'm saying is, what are those standards? And if we're talking about changing the current standards, because the current standards fall within federal guidelines, that in order to have this job, you have to be able to comply with the essential job functions. And I can't deny a person that job by federal law if they can comply with those essential job functions. And we have various physical agility tests to ensure that all of our officers can continue to comply with that. Now, if we're talking about enhancing current physical requirements above what the federal standard is, then I think we probably just need to identify what that is. Is it incentive? Is it requiring them to go through some additional types of physical training, or or whatever that recommendation is? I don't. I think we're talking about the same thing, but I think we would have to define what that means.
So, and that's helpful, Chief. So let me ask this, and I think in a previous conversation, I thought I heard that the Pope hat, hoping I think I'm saying that correctly, the Pope hat was not necessarily a requirement in every jurisdiction. At least I thought that's what I heard. Could we not make a recommendation that a Pope hat is required and an annual Pope hat is required? I mean, that we would have a standardized test. What I need to do to become a police officer or law enforcement officer, I have to pass, and then I have to continue passing it in order to remain employed.
Absolutely. And I hear what you're saying. So that's more of like a physical awareness test. So say, for instance, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, the laws changed so that physical tests didn't prevent officers from being able to, be hired on various police departments. They changed so that they could be more of, can you jump over a fence? Can you drag a body bag? Can you do, instead of, can you do 35 push-ups? And because the average police officer today might not be able to do 35 or 40 push-ups, but he can pull a body bag. So that test really needs to be more about the essential job functions than just, how fast you can run. And over time, the laws have changed so that police departments didn't eliminate officers or didn't prevent officers from being able to do this work, because they were being required to complete tasks that had nothing to do with the job. Can you jump over a 10-foot wall? The average police officer ain't gonna jump over a 10-foot wall, because we're not required to do that on a day-to-day basis. Now, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think there needs to be a larger conversation, because there have been some federal guidelines that have prevented agencies from just implementing tests, so to speak. But I do think there may be some opportunities for ensuring that our officers meet the essential job functions. Now, some agencies have processes in place that if I have an officer who has been injured and for whatever reason he can't go out on the range and qualify, I have to send him through a fitness for duty program. And a lot of officers, unfortunately, don't pass fitness for duties. That means they can't be a police officer anymore. And I know this could probably be a broader conversation, but I just kind of wanted to at least touch on some of what my experiences have been.
What if there was a recommendation that to kind of standardize what you said? You said, okay, our department incentivizes and we give additional time for dedicated to physical enhancement or / mental, whatever. But what if we standardize that? What if the recommendation was that departments will give some form of incentivized program or are tasked with some incentive to create some incentivized program that concentrates on physical and mental wellness or fitness, without mandating that you have to pass a physical or you have to, to get into the details of it. Sheriff, what do you think?
I wanted to add, I know of an agency, a neighboring agency here that does exactly what you're saying. They will offer us a monetary supplement to any officer that can pass the POPAT annually. So it's like a one-time thing. It's not added onto the salary, but kind of like a one-time payment, so to speak. And it has created a lot of incentive to the point we've looked at something like that as well. We've worked hard on trying to bring our fitness standards up. Another thing that we've looked at incorporating the physical standards into is our combat course during qualification processes, where they have to go through a certain amount of physical agility, demonstrate that, and at the same time incorporate being accurate on our combat course. So there's a number of ways that I think that we could accomplish this and move into that direction without just drawing a hard line. And I don't want to sit here and pretend that this one solution would fit or meet the total or address the total problem with fitness. And I was a physical fitness instructor for the state for a long time. And so I'm a believer in that. And I trust me, I believe that we need to be physically fit and mentally healthy in order to do our jobs effectively. I agree with you, polling the folks, Representative, polling the folks and the response you would get. Definitely, I agree with that 100%. We have to be in good physical and mental shape. But at the same time, how we accomplish that, I think conducting some studies to see how that could be accomplished overall, and it could be a combination of things rather than just one thing to help us get that end product we're looking for. May be a better approach at this time. Again, I'm 100% for being able to get to that point, but how we get there is extremely important with what we're dealing with currently in law enforcement agencies across our state and country. So I would certainly be agreeable to something like you mentioned, Mayor, and maybe incorporating that with the studies to see what would be most effective moving forward. And I personally do not believe it's just being able to successfully navigate the POPAT course. And the POPAT has changed. The chief knows the POPAT has changed over the years, and it's not as difficult as it once was. And then the chief made an excellent point about most officers not jumping over a 10-foot wall will, it's not practical because it's not, in many cases, a safe thing to do to begin with when you're tactically, when you're trying to navigate an obstacle like that. And if you're in pursuit or whatever it may be. So, you know, I certainly think we need to look at, are the needs of law enforcement currently being met by the POPAC course that's in place? If there's modifications made to that, and then our officers need to be subjected to some stress on a combat course as well when trying to navigate that. So, you know, again, I certainly believe we can accomplish it, but I think we would be better suited if we had some actual studies done to show what would be most effective in the long run.
And as I see, I'm sorry, I was just gonna say real quick, as I see Leslie typing here, I'm thinking in terms of a 360 approach, maybe, and what that might look like in law enforcement when we're talking about health and wellness, the physical and the mental. And it might be just identifying what can be done by each agency to ensure that we have officers that are physically fit before something happens, you know, and we realize they're not physically fit, and mentally fit. So and I think, not, like I said, not to throw this out, but to how do we massage it so that when we present it to folks, it doesn't go back and forth about what we can and can't do. Because that was the other question that I was gonna ask earlier. I know these are recommendations, but the individuals that will look at these recommendations, Leslie, you know as well as I do, Sheriff too, there are going to be a lot of folks that are going to be ready to push back on change. And you know, I think that the work that is being done here is so valuable that I think we need to be also thinking in terms of what can be received without unnecessary pushback, because these concepts are important and they are needed. So and I don't know what that process is going to be. You know, does it go before commission? Does it go before the governor? And not just for this recommendation, I mean for all of them. And not to take us off of our agenda, but I was just curious about that. How much of this is going to go across the finish line?
Good question.
Well, I would think to that point, I think this is probably a recommendation that needs to be massaged. And I think your points are well taken, Chief. But I think it's important to say, I agree with you, Sheriff. I don't think a lot of this is one size fits all. I do think having standards and then giving departments and local agencies within their own context, size, location, a whole litany of things. You know, I know, you know, sheriff departments, you know, that, I mean, they have a huge number of, you know, 23-year-olds, 25-year-olds. You know, this will be a whole different conversation than, you know, an agency that, you know, had, you know, people my age, you know. So I do think we need to figure out a way to allow people to contextualize it. And I think Chief is correct that we do want to get this across the finish line. And if we don't have it massaged well, there's no chance it will. And I also think it needs to be said from a non-law enforcement person, professionally speaking, that I think this recommendation is also important for the law enforcement officer themselves, because it is a very stressful job. And anytime you work with or for the public, and then when it's physical in nature, when it oftentimes can be for them, I also want them protected. You know, I don't want them in stressful environments where physically they're just not able to. So I do think something needs to be said around the protection of the law enforcement officer themselves as well.
So guys, as we try to catch back up with our agenda schedule, what do you think that this may be one of those items that we send up to the task force that basically, I did hear consistency that we wanted to have some process that had agencies put concentration on physical and mental wellness. Okay, now how that looks and the details to it, I think still needs some discussion. But do we have a consensus that that's an important part of it, and that we want to try to embed this into a recommendation to where we incentivize it, or the departments can implement it based on their capability? Is that consistent with what I'm hearing, or did you want to remove this one and talk about it at a later time?
And further to that, Mayor Coleman, I'm sorry, Roxanne, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Leslie.
I was just gonna say, and further to that, I've made some edits as you were talking to try to capture what everyone was saying. If this doesn't encompass what you're thinking, let me know. We can, if we need to start from scratch, we can. If you think that this gets it done and we move this forward with the edits that I've made, I've tracked the changes so you can see what I took out versus what left in. Just let me know, I'll make whatever changes.
Mayor, when you said suggesting it, were you saying as a recommendation, are we talking about maybe in an edited form, recommending a study?
Well, two things. I think what I heard you all say, and help me if I missed it. One is to track it to see if there is if that makes a better officer, physical and mental wellness, which we can assume that that is the case. And two, to incentivize or to allow departments to handle how they implement it and bring it into their operations on a local level versus a across the board standardized process. Or if we don't have the answers to those two questions in its entirety, to move this to the task force to see if we can have a broader discussion with the group, and to maybe see if they can come up with something, or maybe their group has addressed some of this.
If I'm reading what Leslie has put in here, though, we've pretty much moved it to a study, a recommendation of us to study the issue, which to me would still suggest that we recognize that this is something that needs to perhaps come into play, but we need more information to know how to best address it. So I think if we were to raise this at the way it's been edited by Leslie based upon our conversation, I think this does capture what we're saying. I mean, it doesn't have the teeth it started out with, but it may not need to have the teeth yet, right? Until we really have properly researched it and given it the ability to contextualize. And so if everyone was comfortable with her edits based upon our conversation, I would certainly be comfortable with it.
Okay, that's a good segue to a consensus question. Is there a consensus to leave this as presented now, the edited version? Does that capture?
I agree.
I would be good with it.
Okay. All right. All right, training programs must be studied and measured to ensure desired outcomes and guard against unintended consequences.
And the background on this, for those that missed the last discussion, is that the experts who gave us the feedback on training when we first discussed training all said that, you know, there are a lot of trainings right now that people are calling for. People are calling for implicit bias training. People are calling for racial equity training. People are calling for training on emotional intelligence. And these are all things that are somewhat fluid in the public's understanding of what they are. And there are not a lot of trainings out there on them, and there's not a lot of study about the efficacy of the trainings. And so if we are suggesting that trainings be implemented that have not been studied sufficiently, that we also suggest along with that there are studies to follow those trainings, see if we're achieving desired outcomes. If not, allow us to shift and move towards what is going to make the training achieve the desired outcomes. And so that's what this recommendation was intended to capture.
Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Again, I apologize. I'm playing catch up on this one, but looking at the problem statement where it says we have very little research to show the effectiveness of certain types of training. And then our current training providers do not have staff trained to conduct this type of extensive study. Is necessary to partner with outside agencies. And then under the solution, legislative funding is necessary to hire consultants to develop these trainings. That kind of contradicts itself to me. I mean, we don't have information showing whether it is truly effective or not, but yet we're going to try to secure legislative funding to hire some outside entity. I mean, if this is an identified need, which I think we all agree that we do need this, why wouldn't we look to increase the staffing that we currently have at the Justice Academy and ensure that there's a process to examine or study the effectiveness of the training that's developed and allow that to be developed through there? Because our Justice Academy programs in many areas have been very effective. So I don't really understand why we're on one hand saying we need to hire consultants when we don't even have research showing where what we have is effective or not.
And Sheriff Ingram, I think Trevor was here for our training meeting and he participated in the discussion about this point. I think it's a drafting error to say hire consultants to work with the Justice Academy to develop the courses. The intention was hire staff for the Justice Academy. They need more staff and they need staff who know how to develop these particular types of things. So that was part of the recommendation. But the thing that they are not able to do at the Justice Academy is they're not researchers. They are not able to conduct the kind of study on effectiveness that we would need on some of these things to make sure that if we do it this year and it's a disaster, that we learn from it and know how to fix it for next year. And so we would need an outside entity. So that was what I can change the language to make sure that comes across, but that was the intention of the.
Okay, I appreciate that because I believe in what they're doing, and I certainly believe that we in law enforcement could benefit from additional staffing at the Justice Academy. I just want to make sure that that's where it's at, that's where the focus is, and that when they have a specific need or topic that they're trying to implement, that they have the ability to reach out to various entities to get information or input to make sure that training that they're providing is the most effective. And I know they have some mechanisms in place, and if they need something beyond that, then I think allowing them the ability and the resources needed to do that is great. But I don't want to get into the business of going to outside entities just because they're an outside entity and that somebody may have attended a class and think that's great when we have no research whatsoever that validates that program being better than others that may already be in use.
And that's the other part of it, Sheriff, is that all of the experts that we talked to, and importantly, this came largely from RTI International, talking with them about this issue. The researchers out there in the area of police training are chomping at the bit to be able to study the efficacy of these trainings. And so they really want to partner with people who are going to go forward in these trainings. So the idea was if we as North Carolina are going to go forward with these trainings, they want to partner with us because they want to study the efficacy, and so that there will be that body of research that we need moving forward. And so that's kind of the idea.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else on this matter? So Sheriff, are you good with that, or we need to revise it to kind of, she said there were administrative errors in there, but would the revisions suffice or address the concern you had?
I'm looking at that now. That'd be better if I use my glasses. I'm sorry. Yes, and the solution is legislative funding is necessary to hire consultants to develop these trainings, or I just want to make sure that funding is aimed at assisting our Justice Academy folks to accomplish that mission. And it may not be that they need to actually hire staff for the study of it. They could contract with consultants to help fill the void as needed, so to speak. And I'm trying to be a good steward of our resources as well when I'm saying that. So giving them the flexibility of whether we identify the true need for additional staffing or their ability to contract, but in the end, it is the Justice Academy that's doing that.
Yeah. I would agree, because they could contract individuals that actually do train the trainers for the Justice Academy, especially if this is the direction that we plan to go moving forward. We can utilize our own state entities to provide the type of training that we think is important. So I agree. The way you have it worded here gives us that flexibility.
Okay. Representative Gallard, anything on this?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. We can move this one, Ms. Leslie.
That's our last one, Mayor. So I think
Oh.
we're ready for a vote, and then we can move on.
Okay. All right. So if we could get a motion to approve those recommendations to move forward to the larger task force.
I move that we submit recommendations 1 through 5, I believe it is, forward to the task force.
All right. There's a motion by Chief Davis. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Sheriff Ingram. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor, hands. All right, that's unanimous. Motion carries. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Ms. Leslie, for that. Overview of the public, review of the information from work group 2. I know we started to get into that space a little, but Ms. Leslie, do you have something you want to pop up so that we can kind of run through that real brief?
And I'm just going to ask while I'm bringing that up, Ellen, were you able to get our partners from NACOL, the Zoom invites? I don't see them here on the squares, but it could be that they've not signed on. I just want to make sure that they had, oh, Liana, there you are. Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, she's right.
Okay. I think I had my small squares when I was screen sharing, so I did not see. Okay, let's see. I have so many windows open, I apologize, y'all. I'm trying to. Information from.
Greetings to the co-chairs. I see they've joined us, Justice Earls and Attorney General.
Yes.
Okay.
Good to see you all.
Making sure again that y'all, I've got the right screen shared with you because I have 3 monitors up. This should say information from work group 2. Is that what y'all are seeing?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, work group 2 has some topics that overlap with our topics. And what we're trying to do is streamline the consideration and discussion of those topics. So there will be some where we send recommendations for them to look at after we're done. And there have been some where they're sending us their recommendations to look at before being finalized so that we can give any feedback and they can come as a joint recommendation between the groups. So the recommendations first from work group 2 that deal with training are these 1 through 4 that you see here under the work group 2 recommendations. And so what they were sent, the first 2 were sent to the entire commission and as part of the straw poll. And Ellen, if I'm misspeaking here, make sure to correct me. The first 2 regarding training for schools at SROs, and then funding for school personnel to complete mental health, first aid, and cultural competence, diversity, inclusion, and developmental disability training. Those should have been part of the straw poll that you guys have to respond to by close of business today. That was sent to all task force members. And so
Leslie, really quickly on that point, we are going to send that out today. They just wanted to finish up their problem statement in future state. So that's not out with all of you yet, but it will be right after this meeting. But yeah,
Great.
That's what they are.
Thank you, Ellen. And then the other two, crisis intervention team training should be made part of the curriculum for BLET, and North Carolina Justice Academy should develop training for law enforcement agency heads that focuses on community policing. Those are working drafts. If we want to join with them in those recommendations, that's where their work group overlaps with ours, even though training is technically under our purview. Some of their topics lend themselves to discussions of training. So I think that the idea would be, if we want to join with them in these 4 recommendations, we can vote to do that. Otherwise, we can, when they come through as their recommendations, we can just vote on them, you each individually as members of the task force when it comes to the poll.
Any thoughts on this, guys?
Mayor?
Yes, sir.
Under I, A and I, or 1, whatever that would be, the Department of Public Instruction in consultation with Justice Academy should develop and deliver training for all public school employees and SROs regarding the role and proper use of SROs. What is the definition of proper use?
Sure, if that is not a question that I have the answer to. Ellen, if you know, or Jasmine, if y'all are there.
Sheriff, the working group did not define it in their recommendation, but I can tell you in conversations with Secretary Hooks that there was a lot of concern in making sure that that lined up with what the Justice Academy is teaching about the proper use of SROs and what this Task Force for Safer Schools is saying. So I think the spirit of that is that SROs are not intended to be used for school discipline. And that those disciplinary matters should generally be handled through the school process and not the criminal justice process. And I think that's consistent with where everybody is in the sort of who's working on this from various angles, but the language itself was not defined by the working group.
And that just concerns me. I want to make sure that does not get lost when we have just a statement out there and we don't define what that is, which I agree with what you said, but you know, in my humble opinion, that needs to be stated. The last thing we need to do is leave it open-ended for somebody else to determine what the proper use is, or be determined at a later time. That's not necessarily consistent with what we believe now.
I think the working group had some conversations and probably ran out of time to go back, and they just wanted to make sure they didn't define it differently than it was defined in these other documents that are being worked on. So I think there is an intention to clarify that.
So is there a standard, and this is just my own ignorance, I guess, is there a standard description or job description for SROs around the state of North Carolina?
I don't know the answer to that, Chief.
Okay, because, you know, it has it has been a common subject matter, and that might be something to think about at some point, maybe standardize what that job description is, because it has been misinterpreted what police officers' roles are in the school by administrations, by school administrations, by teachers, and, you know, even parents sometimes. So something to think about.
And so I guess the issue here is, do we want, they're sending us these recommendations because technically training is our area of responsibility and not theirs. So the question is, do we want to suggest edits to them, or do we want to join with them, or do we want to let them have at it in terms of if they've got additional recommendations to ours, and then you all will vote on them as part of the straw poll sent to the entire task force? I mean, you know, we don't necessarily need to take over what they're doing, but if we want to join with them, we can. And so we want to have the option to do that.
And so just to, sorry, Mayor, go ahead.
No, I was basically saying, so I guess what you're proposing, Ms. Les, is we can add our comments to that. Like Sheriff Ingram said, basically we need more specifics on the role. Chief Davis asked the same question. So would it be appropriate, I guess we just add comments if we have any to that versus trying to start from scratch?
Yes, sir. When it comes out as a poll, there is an area for you to comment. And again, Ellen, Jasmine, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is there's an area for you to comment on the specific recommendation if you have further feedback. The purpose of which is intended to allow staff to then take all the comments from the task force members and work them into the recommendation before they go to the final task force vote.
Okay. Anything else under these under this first section of training, guys, that we see that want to add anything to?
And if not, then the second is data collection. This one is in its final form as a recommendation. So we can either join it, we can edit it and send it back to them for their approval, or we could write our own recommendation to complement that one. That would be, brought together eventually before the entire task force. So they're requesting a statute should be enacted that requires law enforcement agencies to report to the State Bureau of Investigation a standard set of information regarding uses of force by law enforcement officers. The statute should require that every use of force be reported, with use of force defined as physical force with or without a weapon beyond that necessary to handcuff a compliant subject. Each report shall include information about the type of force used, any injury sustained, the justification for the use of force, and demographic information, including race, for both the officers and the subjects involved. Each report shall include any information collected by the FBI's National Use of Force Data Collection, and SBI shall submit each report to the FBI on behalf of the agency that originally submitted the report to the SBI. The data shall be made publicly available and searchable to the extent compatible with personnel privacy laws. I will flag for you that one of the 4 topics set for us to discuss today in the next hour, which I'm not sure how we're going to accomplish all that, is data collection. And it could be that that we agree with what they have drafted here, but that we also have recommendations for further data collection that are within our scope of consideration in terms of accountability and culture. Theirs is just use of force, that we might have our recommendation and then allow staff to perhaps meld the two into one data collection recommendation at the end. And that might be I don't want to say better use of our time, but I mean, it might be a more compatible way for us to work parallel and get all the work done that needs to be done.
Well, let me just ask a question, and we've got professional law enforcement here, legislators, so I don't know. But so a law enforcement officer is given are you granted a state license, or is it's just a certification as an officer? Once you become an officer, you're an officer. So is there a license that can be taken from North Carolina law enforcement officer?
Yes.
Okay. So
their certification can be taken away.
All right. Every other license, state issued license, when there's a complaint or anything, I'm in the funeral business, so I've got a funeral license regulated by a funeral board, and a customer can get online and look at any complaints I've had. Okay. But with the law enforcement piece, instead of it considering it a professional license that is public information, when you have an issue, they wrap it under personnel as if you're late for work or you sexually harass someone or something like a worker. So why is there a distinction between that? The ability of the public to see just generic information. Why? Because that is what we run into when we start having the conversations about review boards and other things. That is personnel and you can't get to it.
Yes, sir. So I actually have slides prepared for you, Mayor Colvin, about what the state of the law is and why that is so. So when we get through this part, the next set of
Okay.
slides I've got is the
All right.
legal landscape that'll help answer that question, I think.
Okay, all right. All right, any comments or questions on the data collection section?
The only comment that I had is that some agencies are already reporting to the FBI's National Use of Force Data Collection. I know this was Work Group 2's recommendation. I just didn't know whether or not this would be a duplication of work to submit to the SBI for the SBI to submit to the FBI on behalf of the agency. Might just be a process piece, but most agencies that are part of the FBI's National Use of Force data collection already has a process in place where they submit directly to the FBI.
Chief, just a point of clarification. I think there are a couple, the working group did discuss that issue and
Okay.
discuss where this data should go. A couple of things to flag. One, that they attempted to put a use of force definition here. There was a lot of discussion about the need for a statewide definition of use of force. That use of force definition that they are suggesting is broader than what the FBI currently collects. And so this would be setting up a new structure to collect using that definition and then forwarding on to the FBI. And so not quite a duplication, although it would be a change from what some are currently doing. I know that Secretary Hooks also had a conversation with the SBI folks and the folks at the new center on the reduction of the use of force. I may be messing up that name, about their ability to collect and house this new data. And so there have been a lot of conversations about how that, which was also created by this executive order that created this task force, would work together.
Okay, sounds good. And I'm sure I'm not the only law enforcement person that probably, was wondering, because I know they are two different sets of use of force data that's collected. I collect more use of force data just in my department to provide to the public through our website than I send to the National Use of Force Data Collection team, as well. So thank you for that clarification.
Well, I guess the reason I asked my question is, who has access to it? I mean, we can collect it and it goes to all of these various agencies, but how do you get to it?
So the recommendation also states that it should be made publicly available and searchable. So that was one of the key points that came out of the working group as well, the key suggestions.
Okay. All right.
So I think I would suggest to the group that we support their recommendation, knowing that we will probably make additional data collection recommendations that will be then combined with this one for an overall data collection recommendation. Or, when the report is generated to the governor, it will include all data recommendations probably in one area if this group is satisfied with that. I think that'll streamline our ability to move forward and consider the other things that we have to consider that we're being asked to consider under accountability. Also, just flagging these, we do not need to discuss them now, but the Sentinel event review. So in the pre-work, I sent out this same document to you with the link here to the SharePoint site for the Sentinel event review. That is in draft form, and that will be something we need to discuss here in a minute. I resent it in a separate link just to make sure everybody had it before the meeting. And then the early intervention systems, this is their draft. This is not set for our agenda today. We can come back to this document with work group 2. I just wanted you to have it in advance. We're set to discuss the Sentinel, the early warning systems at the next meeting on October 15th. So just, it's all here in one document for you, but this document we'll be reviewing or referring back to it throughout the course of today's meeting and also the next couple meetings also. So we don't have to discuss those today, but they're there for you to consider for our discussion the next time. And I think, and so that's all as it relates to our discussion of information from work group 2. And then the next thing that I have for you, as I mentioned, Mayor Colvin, is the overview of the public records laws. And that is designed to give you an understanding of where we currently are, so that when you're discussing the topics like civilian review boards, Sentinel event review, and later on when we get to the body cam footage, that you'll understand where we are legally with the law right now and whether or not we want to make any recommendations for change at some point. So, let's see. Okay, hopefully you all have the screen that I've got, which is my legal overview PowerPoint. Okay, looking at personnel files, this is something that we have talked about quite a bit. The personnel file laws for state employees are captured in North Carolina General Statute 126-22 and the statutes that follow that. And those employees, when we're thinking about state employees in law enforcement, we're thinking about SBI, High Patrol, ALE, corrections. Those laws say that the personnel files of those employees are not generally subject to inspection, but that there are some records open to inspection. And Mayor Colvin, this goes to your question. 126-23 sub 9 says the date and type of promotion, transfer, suspension, and separation. Those are available right now as public records. And sub 11 says the date and type of each dismissal, suspension, or demotion for disciplinary reason. And then if it's a dismissal, a document that includes the specific acts or omissions forming the basis of the dismissal. How that relates to commissions is that the commissions aren't technically keeping personnel files on every officer, but they provide that same information on the reason for decertification, if there's decertification through the commissions. And that is something that commissions are currently working on, putting a database up on DOJ's website to make sure it's searchable. And that is already public information. It's just making it more searchable and more available to folks, rather than having to call each commission. They can search it on the website. So DOJ is working on that currently. The other thing I will say as a sidebar is that the information from the commissions, when individuals go through a process that affects their certification, the PC, the probable cause proceedings before the commission are not public. But once probable cause is found, either the entry of the order after probable cause is public, or the contested case that proceeds to the Office of Administrative Hearings is public, and the documents that go along with that. The final agency decision is public, and then anything that gets appealed from there is public. So while the investigative file might not be public out of the commission, certainly the final agency decision and the proceedings before the commission at that point are public. 126-24 holds that all other personnel file information in the personnel file is confidential. This also applies to county and city employees, different statutes. I've given you the statutes here. County employees, obviously being sheriff's deputies and telecommunicators, to name a few, and then police officers being city employees. Same general rules, almost the exact same language as state employees. It's just all found in one particular statute for each of those types. So that is currently what is governing the release of information in North Carolina with respect to personnel files. If these things, if it falls outside of these areas, it's not typically available to, say, a civilian review board. When you're talking about law enforcement agency recordings, again, in terms of what's available to a civilian review board, these statutes are 132-1.4 sub A deals with recordings that are not public records but may be released upon a court order. So certain information is a public record. 911 call, but you have to make sure to alter the voices or give a transcript to protect victims and witnesses. Law enforcement radio traffic, like CAD recordings, are subject to being released as public records. A law enforcement agency, though, can seek a court order to withhold those under certain circumstances, and the statute lays that out. But when you're talking about something like a body cam or a dash cam, where a person's image or voice is recorded, it can only be released to that person or their personal representative. Right now it says the law enforcement agency shall only. So it's not discretionary to the police right now to release to the media or anyone else. The only people that they are allowed to, per statute, release to are these individuals or their personal representatives. This includes body-worn cameras, dashboard cameras, and other recording devices. I could, you say what other recording devices, I could think of something used during a confidential informant spy or something like that. But the law enforcement agency does have the discretion to withhold it if they can consider certain factors. A person can then appeal that to Superior Court, but it's an abuse of discretion standard. There is an expedited release process, but that requires a court order, and then release to any other entity like the media or a civilian review board or anyone else for that matter. It shall only be released to those people by a court order, and then there are factors listed in the statute that the court has to consider. So someone would have to apply to a court for a court order in order to be able to release those documents to, say, a civilian review board. Internal affairs investigations are usually called personnel files because the agency then uses them to evaluate employee performance and determine necessary training or personnel actions. So agencies typically call them personnel files. External investigations, though, that, for example, usually in an IA or use of force are done by the SBI, they are considered criminal investigations and are therefore not public records pursuant to the statutes we just reviewed. Criminal investigation records are not public records such that they have to be released. It's a permissive statute. They may be released, but they don't have to be released. A couple things to think about as you talk through these issues. Consider whether we want to divide that information. The actual disposition of a use of force in the matter becomes part of the personnel file, but perhaps the facts in the report could be released to the public or to a civilian review board. Consider redacting personnel protected information instead of just calling it all part of the personnel file. Consider aggregating that data to track trends within the agency and do it in a summary report so that it doesn't become part of an individual's personnel file, and so it's not protected under the personnel laws. Those are some potential solutions available currently, and of course the other recommendation would be to revise the personnel statutes in their entirety. So that is the legal landscape as it relates to the personnel laws and for the discussion that's upcoming. I also have, Mayor Colvin, the slides that I sent you earlier that could help go through the discussion points for the group as you start to talk about these issues.
Okay.
So looking at oh dear, my computer is completely frozen. Let's see if I can fix it. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to fix it. Okay.
Leslie, is it shared anywhere that you could share it with me and I can share my screen for you?
That is unfortunate. No, but I think maybe I hit the wrong button. Okay, I got it. I hit the wrong button. Too much technology. Okay. So the discussion points moving forward. First of all, this is our schedule, and I think that we can already see that we are going to probably push to the 1022 and 1028 meetings to need to get through all the topics that we have to discuss. Today, we were set to talk about civilian oversight boards, Sentinel event reviews, data collections, and physical and psychological evaluations. I think it's doubtful we'll get through all of that. And then on 1015, set to talk about mandating body cams, asset forfeiture, early warning systems, and then standards commission issues. In addition to the standards commissions issues we've already talked about, there have been suggestions that we should consider adding additional reasons for decertification to the administrative code, adding a collection of different data for discipline and decertification and use of force on the part of the commissions, and then the dissemination of that data to agencies, or requiring agencies to check with the commissions before they hire an individual, say, to see whether or not they have had been the subject of any of these reports. So all of that is, I wanted you to have the full view of what we're set to discuss and then ask if there's anything else that you as the committee feel that we need to cover in terms of accountability and culture. This list was generated from the feedback received from the entire task force when you first filled out your surveys at the very beginning of this process, and then also from the public feedback that we've received, and then just from the hot topics in the areas of accountability and culture. But if we're missing something and we need to add that in, we have essentially 4 meetings to cover what we need to cover. And so please let me know. You can either do it now, or if you want to send me an email or call me if we need to add something to the list. Obviously, this is your discussion.
Yeah, Leslie, I want to make sure that we're not overloading the work group with some of these things that are basically will be a policy recommendation or not. You know, as we talked about, let's say for instance, mandating body cams or early warning systems, some of that, you know, I'm not clear as to if this came in from the overall group. I understand it fit into our space, but you know, it'll still come back as a recommendation to go back to the overall group. Is that what you're saying? Because we only have a short amount of meetings, and to try to cover all this in any form of detail with some of this, I'm not really understanding what the proposed outcome is for us to send it right back to the overall task force.
Right, so essentially there are 2 days that there are 2 overall task force meetings coming up, one on October 9th, one on November 6th. On each of those days, each of the 4 task forces, 4 working groups are going to report out to the full task force on items that the full task force needs to vote on. These are things that you all received from Ellen. When she sends out the straw poll, those are the formalized recommendations from each of the working groups that you will then be asked to vote for. And so in sending out the straw polls ahead of time, it's helping staff get an understanding of what changes need to be made so that the task force can then work through approving each of them on this very tight timeline that we've had. Talking about these subjects that I have here on the screen, these do not fall within the purview of any other working group, with the exception of Sentinel event review and early warning systems, and that's where we overlap with working group 2.
So I guess
recommendations.
I guess my question was, say for instance, physical and psychological evaluations, okay? The policy piece to where we think is necessary or not, we kind of hit that a little bit this morning, but this group can say, is the expectation that we say or drill down into how to execute that, or if that's a necessary thing that needs to be implemented or recommended out of this group? That's the kind of work I'm talking about, because some of this.
I think, Mayor, that it's essentially, we are expected to come up with recommendations that are concrete and do have policy. So for example, if how to accomplish that is that we need a legislative change, or we need to recommend something to the commission, or you know, we need to do some other sort of solid change, we can do that. But if it's something that is more broad, then that is also a possibility. For example, we don't have to write a model policy for a police agency on physical and psychological evaluations. That's a phase 2 kind of consideration, done probably after some study, as we have talked about today. But we would want to say, we do think that there should be physical or psychological evaluations. We think they should occur with X frequency or at X juncture, and here's why. And we think it should be in the administrative code, and we would recommend those to the commissions. So it would be something like that we would come up with. We don't have to write the policy that Chief Davis would then have to implement, or Sheriff Ingram in their agency, if that makes sense. We don't have to go to that level of detail.
Okay.
So my first question would be, to any one of you, are there things that deal with accountability and culture that are not captured by these topics that you feel it is our duty to look at? And I will add them to the schedule. And if you can't think of any, or if there aren't any and you think of one later, feel free to let me know. You know, we do have the 1022 and 1028 meetings. I think it's going to take us all 4 of these meetings to get through these. And our first set of recommendations will be considered by the full task force next Friday on 10/9. When the process that has been set up, just for y'all's edification, when we get back feedback on our recommendations from the full task force, staff is going to send me the red line changes that are made based on the feedback of the entire task force. And I'll need to email that out to you, but I'll need each of you to get back with me to approve that moving forward. So we'll have to have a kind of tight turnaround on that. So I wanted to flag for you, and that will occur for the first time next week. On Monday, I should be sending you some red line changes. So I just wanted to let you know and flag that that was coming from me so that you would know that we need tight turnaround on that. So the first set of discussion, and to show you the slides so we can then go back and forth, I've got civilian oversight boards, data collection, physical psychological evaluations as kind of, these are questions for discussion. I don't think we're gonna get through all of that today. We've got Liana on the line. I can leave these up if that's helpful to the discussion. I can also take them down if there's another way that we want to move through the discussion. But I think the first new topic that we need to discuss is civilian oversight boards. And with that, I'll introduce Liana Perez, who is on with us from NACOL, and you got a lot of pre-work. The video is from NACOL, as well as 3 of their pre-publication summaries on civilian oversight boards. And so as you talk through these issues, she is here as a resource for you. And she was also one of the 2 presenters on the video that you watched as part of the pre-work. So Liana is here, and Mayor Colvin, that's all I've got, and I will just stand by as needed.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I guess obvious question is, do we think we need a civilian oversight board? I certainly believe that it's kind of twofold. You certainly, as I try to explain to people in our community when all of this, flared up recently, was that until there's a legislative change that kind of allows this board, whatever you call it, to do anything, I kind of looked at Leslie's summarization of it, where basically, it said, I guess the decision to create it will depend on what its capabilities are, because it's only going to frustrate people if you create it and it can't do anything. What are your thoughts on, what is your thought on that?
Well, I would say that, I think there needs to be some serious thought about the functionality, as you said, Mayor. What is the functionality of a civilian review board? We have a Citizens Police Academy going on right now. And in the Citizens Police Academy are individuals who will be serving on our civilian review board. It's one of the requirements. And it became one of the requirements because we spent a lot of time, and it's been very beneficial, and the civilian review board members say it's very beneficial because we've spent a lot of time trying to ensure that those individuals making the decisions really understand, the various dynamics of police work, the whys. And Sheriff, you've probably been in this situation numerous times as well, trying to help people understand what that snapshot on the video that was on the news was really all about. And then sometimes once that explanation is there, then folks have a different perspective. I think if we are recommending civilian oversight boards, there needs to be a broader understanding of the work that's done every day. I think civilian review boards are good. And as far as how much they can do, I think that's probably a conversation that the broader group probably needs to be involved in. But I really do believe that it should be more than just getting a group of people together to make decisions about various types of situations involving police officers.
Well, that's a good point. I know we talked about that in our community that, you know, if you just grab regular citizens, which I think you need that perspective, but they're not familiar with the law or law enforcement or the process, how effective is that really?
Yeah.
And so I see that, I guess your point to training, I certainly understand that, and what their capabilities are, what their background is. Representative Gallo, you had anything on this, or Sheriff Ingram?
Yeah, I'm trying to listen to the law enforcement perspective on this.
And really my perspective too, for everybody on this call is not just the police perspective, as a citizen. Of course, I know more about what happens internally, but from an external standpoint, I do believe that we should always strive for more transparency. And when you're doing the right thing, you don't have a problem with sharing what that is. And I think opportunities to be transparent are very important, and have input are very important. So I certainly support civilian oversight boards. My other question is, how much of that is governed by city ordinance, that those processes are outlined or put in place by what the city, the city ordinance or city directive is, as opposed to what the state would want, or what the state might recommend?
Well, Sheriff Ingram, you have any perspective on any of this?
Yes, sir. Number one, what is the goal? You said it earlier, we don't have really a definition of what a civilian oversight board is supposed to look like. Chief, I'm not familiar with yours. I would love to hear more about it. But I think what we're talking about at the end of the day is transparency, and having an agency that works in a transparent manner with regards to addressing public concerns and issues. And I can assure you that there's no better law enforcement official to act in a transparent manner and address public concerns than a sheriff. We're elected. Every 4 years, we're having a civilian oversight board, if you may, and evaluating how we do our job, but not just during the election process. It's a continual thing. So if it's transparency, that can be accomplished in a number of ways, and not just through a civilian oversight board where you may share information regarding specific things, but very little beyond that. We started a Citizens Academy shortly after I took over as sheriff, and we've run hundreds of people through that academy. But at the same time, we had an ulterior motive, and that was to create a volunteer force. And in doing that, we have well over 300 active volunteers involved in our agency in just about every aspect of this agency, where they're involved in the day-to-day functions in many cases, multiple layers of that. We did that so we could open the doors of our agency to the public, to the very people. It's their office, it's not my office. And we get people in here to be a part of it and to understand what's going on. And it's not just about specific issues or incidents that we share with them. It's on a daily basis. So for me to be agreeable to something titled as a civilian oversight board, I would need to know what that was supposed to look like in the end, and what you're trying to accomplish. Because if it's transparency, there's a number of effective ways to do that. And we've demonstrated that as an agency time and again. And I think we need a little clarification on where we're going with that. And again, Chief, I would love to hear more about yours.
Yeah, ours is basically, an oversight board that is made up of about 10 individuals that are appointed by the city manager. I think they go through um, a bit of a background process, but it's not anything extensive. And they come from different walks of life, attorneys or ministers and so on. And what they do is actually review complaints that are filed by citizens and to make sure that the department is making recommendations or sustaining or exonerating in manners that are consistent with what they believe is ensuring that people's rights, are being taken under consideration and that officers are being held accountable appropriately. They'll make a recommendation, or they may have questions about why a particular case was exonerated or sustained, and we provide those responses to them. For the most part, and I mentioned this in another meeting, for the most part, our civilian oversight board is normally aligned in their recommendations with the police department. There have been few challenges to disciplinary actions from our civilian oversight board. No, they don't have the power to make recommendations to the DA or to a grand jury about what they think should happen in a criminal case, or that an officer should be criminally charged. We leave that up to the SBI's investigation. If they get done with an investigation, they forward it on to the DA's office, and the DA will make that determination. And they do not take personnel actions and don't have the power to do that as well. And I think that has a lot to do with the state law here in North Carolina as it relates to personnel issues. Mayor Colvin, you hit on that earlier. What can be revealed to the public and shared with the public about personnel files.
So,
Chief, how do they get? How do you get around that protected information under North Carolina law in order to share the complete situation with the citizens that are on that review board?
Well, what I have to do is I have to do my own, background work on that because, this board was in place before I got here. I've been here for about 4.5 years, and I don't know that there's something that is in state law that permits such oversight. It could be, I'm just not familiar with it. But they actually do have an opportunity to review files. Some information is redacted. I don't think the employee's name is redacted, but certain information is redacted, protect, individuals and other individuals in the public as well. But I'll get back with you on that, Sheriff, just to maybe provide some more insight of how they do get around some of these personnel laws.
So here's from a perspective of a citizen and a non-law enforcement person. What I hear, and this is not reflective on any of your departments, and thank God, not a lot of it in our state lately, but the public doesn't have trust and confidence in the process when there's a bad actor. Okay, I think as the sheriff said, what's the goal? What's the purpose? The purpose is to build more trust and faith in the process of checks and balances. And right now, at least in our case, this is a conversation we had. When there's a complaint against a law officer, it runs through an internal process that, I don't know if it starts with his supervisor and then up to the next rank above, and then makes it to the chief, and they make a decision internally as to whether he acted outside of his bounds or not. There's not a lot of confidence in that process because there's always going to be a sense that the goal is to build more of that. And I think even after that, yes, they'll send or call in, you know, particularly on certain cases, if there's shooting or something, they'll call in the SBI. But how many recommendations has the SBI came back with that said a police officer acted in a bad manner that recommended charges? And so because I'm not saying that they deserved it, but right now the process we have doesn't have a lot of confidence of the public because it's law enforcement investigating law enforcement. So how do we bring citizens and non-law enforcement into that process that brings more confidence? I think is the ultimate goal. And Miss Leslie, you had some things to add, and then I'll turn back over to you guys.
So to give a little bit more context also, in considering what the ask is here of, I think, of this working group and what you're being asked to do with respect to civilian oversight boards. Obviously, I think as is clear by Chief Davis's comments, the civilian oversight boards are probably a local entity, I think. And so the question for this task force is whether we want to recommend civilian oversight boards to the local entities or jurisdictions. And if so, if we want to recommend them using particular resources like the ones we sent out and that Liana can speak more to, or, you know, they've been working with Fayetteville and can obviously be contacted. And then the other thing that we could recommend is if we wanted to recommend legislative change to personnel laws. And also if we wanted to make legislative change to allow civilian review boards to take charges to the grand jury or to the district attorney or to take personnel action. There are varying things on the spectrum that y'all can consider, but I think the ask from this work group is, do we want to recommend civilian oversight boards? If so, do we want to recommend legislation to address certain barriers and obstacles that civilian oversight boards have? So I think that's one of the questions I think that the task force is looking for this working group to answer.
So I did have one more point to that. Thank you for laying out the kind of the framework. I personally think it should be more of a state board function that takes the local politics out of the equation, because right now, at the end of the day, people who are connected or the implication that they're connected, you know, still would have an opportunity to do that. And I'll give an example of what I mean. As I said, with my funeral board, you have so many appointments that two come from the governor's office, two come from the association that we deal with. And so when you in law enforcement cases, there could be a couple recommendations from the associations, or maybe CJ has a member and someone else, and the Sheriff's Association has a member. Maybe the North Carolina Bar of Attorneys has a couple of appointments. And so you have a state level board that ultimately reviews the conduct. They would be very busy, I'm sure, with all of the complaints that come in. So maybe you have to work through if there's any kind of local function that's referred up to that, or if they have the ability to get involved in certain things so that they don't catch everything. But to have an independent appointed board that took the local influence away, with subject matter experts and with appointees, and maybe some of them are just citizens like some of these other state regulatory boards, that they review your stuff. If they think that you've committed some crime, then they refer it to a prosecutor for some action, or they're able to fine or to revoke, you know, whatever state issued licensing you have. So I think it should, you know, my personal opinion, I think it should be a state level situation.
Mayor Colvin, I put up on the screen here the Sentinel event review that I sent to everybody ahead of time. And this is something that is passed through working group number 1. The Sentinel event review is a little bit different than a civilian oversight board, but encompasses some of the things that you're talking about in terms of statewide review. The purpose of a Sentinel event review, as y'all know from the pre-work readings, is to look at the systemic problems, not just say who is responsible for this one officer involved shooting, but what led us to this place and what needs to happen either within the entire agency or within the entire culture of law enforcement in order to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again. They use it in aviation, they use it in medicine when something happens. That's why I think that the article said, you know, now we don't have nearly as many airplane crashes because they use these Sentinel event reviews to try to fix the systemic problems as opposed to deal with one particular shooting or one particular issue. So the Sentinel event committee, or I guess Sentinel event review process, if we were to enact this model that Working Group 2 has passed, is something that sits at the state level. It comes out of, it would be housed within the standards divisions within DOJ. It would be 7 members who are diverse in lots of different ways, and as you can read here, but also the 4 members, 4 of those 7 would come from the standards commissions, 2 from each commission to be appointed by the commission chairs. And then the remaining 3 would be either nominated by the AG, NC Cred, the chair of CJ, or the chair of sheriffs on a rotating basis. And those are to be 1 person who is a criminal justice reform organization member, 1 person who's a racial justice organization member, and 1 person who's a victim advocate organization member. And so that makes up a total of 7. And then there are 20 additional local committee members to be part of what's called the site team. And the site team is, once a site is chosen for a particular review, the local community gets involved in the site team review. And so, for example, if you had a particularly bad officer-involved shooting in Charlotte, then the 20 site team review members would be local community members to be a part of that site team. And it would be looking at more systemic issues as opposed to just looking at each officer-involved shooting or each use of force incident. These would be selected, and you can read through the proposal here, but it's a little bit different than looking at every single use of force incident by a civilian oversight board in a particular community. This is a statewide entity that would look at particular Sentinel events and then come up with recommendations for systemic change as a result of that. So that can be part of the discussion as you're thinking through state versus local, what types of things we would want to recommend. This Sentinel event review has passed through Working Group 2, and they're asking us to now look at it as well.
Representative Galliard, what are you thinking? I see something.
Yeah, I've got really mixed feelings on this. I think the first thing that's rolling around for me is there another, I mean, we talk a little bit about this, but is there another way to arrive at what we're trying to accomplish? I mean, is there any data around the effectiveness of review boards? I mean, everything I'm reading suggests that they don't have a lot of effectiveness, but I could be wrong. So is there another model or another way to get at this? Is one question I have. And then I guess my struggle, and I like the thought of a statewide possibility as I look at this Sentinel event review process, but it's just something about community contextual engagement that this process strips itself of. And I get a little nervous about that. And as much as I know there's got to be this broader standard statewide, I do think communities having the ability to address their own issues is powerful. And so I don't know that I like any of the options, is what I'm saying. But unfortunately, you know, my daddy told me, you know, you don't have a solution, then keep your mouth shut. So, you know, I don't have a better option here, not necessarily, but I think I would like to know a little bit more about have review boards even been successful in what they're attempting to accomplish.
Can I just jump in on one clarifying point on the Sentinel event review, having been a part of the drafting of this document and Working Group 2's conversations, I want to make sure that everybody knows that these are completely different than citizen review boards and citizen oversight boards. They just have a different purpose. The purpose of a Sentinel event review is to be non-punitive, as Leslie said. It is not to figure out who should be fired, who should be charged. Regardless of the authority of the Civilian Review Board, those are the types of things that they are sort of wrestling with. This is wrestling with what went wrong and how can we fix it in the future. There'll be a limited number of issues that they can take up by definition, and they'll be selected on a case-by-case basis by the committee. And it would be, I think the idea would be to somewhat professionalize the process. And so I wouldn't want us to combine the issues too much. And I guess to my mind, a Civilian Review Board at the statewide level doesn't really make sense, not only because the Sentinel Event Review exists, but also because they seem to be fundamentally community-based concepts in terms of, sort of having that relationship with your local community. So as you consider those concepts, please don't conflate them.
So Jasmine, just so I'm clear, this is not an either or. This is more of a both and: Sentinel review process and community review boards, citizen review boards.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing that I heard that I really wanted to emphasize is that I think most people would agree that if these things are going to exist, they should exist with at least something that makes it worthwhile. What that something is for discussion. But if they don't have any power or don't feel like they have any influence or transparency, I think everybody would agree that that the utility is somewhat limited. So, but I don't know the answer to your question about sort of, what the utility is and what's required to make it really feel like it's doing the goal that everybody has.
I'll let them know I better jump off.
So Mayor, does the Sentinel review process satisfy the comment you made about having a statewide process, or you think it's different?
What I think I heard from Jasmine is that this is more of a systems review than a person review. And so whether what I'm talking about is a group of citizens or not, I don't think that's the point. The point is that you've got to take the accountability process, of when officers' conduct is brought into question out of the local arena and politics. You don't have a local district attorney that's going to step up 99% of the time and charge one of the local officers unless he just has his arm twisted. I mean, it just is not happening on a regular enough basis that anybody has confidence that ever will happen. And so what I'm saying is that you don't put your local district attorney in that situation where you have a situation where the department is investigating themselves. Say something comes out of it, they may or may not send it to the SBI depending on the criteria in their policy. And then you're depending on your local district attorney who has to get elected every 4 years to indict a police officer. I mean, we're watching that play out in Kentucky right now. And so what I'm saying is that if there is some type of state board, it doesn't necessarily have to be civilians. It could be appointees from different places that understand law enforcement and the law that now give their recommendation and their review of a process, and it just takes the local politics out. So I guess I injected that into the civilian review discussion, but it's more of an accountability. What can we do to increase public confidence in what we're doing? This right here reviews the department and the organization.
Yeah, and Mayor, I think that's a slightly different but related conversation, because it seems to me what you're talking about is the criminal investigation and how officer involved killings are investigated, who investigates them, who prosecutes them if warranted. And so that's a related conversation, but it need not require a board.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to flag that. I don't know if that was on the slides, but I think that is something that's been in the idea bank and in on the list for conversation.
Okay, all right.
If I could jump in, I hate that I have to jump off this call because this is a very important conversation that I would love to continue to be involved in, but I do have to jump off. I do think that the Sentinel piece it reminds me, and I don't know, Jasmine, I know you plugged out real quick there, but is this similar to the manner in which consent decrees are played out, just sort of oversight of an agency that has demonstrated problems in certain areas, and then this committee sort of takes a deeper dive into the agency to see what kind of systemic problems may exist. Is that what it does?
Not in the current draft, although, you know, it certainly could be tied into, as you know, there's the new statewide accreditation process that is happening. And so there could be a loop back to that process, but this is still individual case review.
I see.
But it's an individual case review that's intended to be non-punitive and to bring broader policy implications.
Well, you all feel free to email me if there's anything else that you would like for me to contribute toward this conversation, or Leslie, you can text me or whatever. I have another meeting I got to jump off and get on, and I'll be catching up with you all real soon. Thanks a lot, everybody, and have a great day.
See you, Chief.
All right.
If I can add, Mayor Colvin, I think to your point, the reason why I raised Sentinel Event Review at the time I did is because you were asking about something to do statewide. And so I think the considerations are Sentinel Event Review is up for our consideration as kind of a broader statewide systems look at what systemically went wrong in order to get to a particular place in a particular event. Then we consider the civilian oversight boards and whether we want to make any recommendations at the local level. And the third part of that, which I think is separate but related, as Jasmine mentioned, is whether this group wants to consider recommending certain changes related to officer-involved killings or shootings, whichever they may be, investigations. Do they want to be standardized that the SBI does all of them? Do they want to be standardized that some other group does all of them? Do they want to be standardized as to where they're prosecuted, or any recommendations as it relates to that? I think they're all interrelated, although they are separate questions as y'all are talking through those issues.
What was your Sentinel review proposal only set up to review local jurisdictions, or was it something that you look at the state agencies, even like the, you know, like I said, I don't know what the percentages are, right? But what are the percentages of complaints that have gone up for officer-involved shootings to the SBI and have come back not in favor of the officer?
And
you know, is there ever a review of that, all of that?
So I don't think that we have the statistics, and I do know that we've talked about that previously in another meeting as to what are the number of times the SBI has come back and said that it was not a good shoot or something like that. I don't know that we've got those statistics at hand, but I will say in terms of the Sentinel Event Review Committee, the committee gets to choose which events to review. And if that shooting involved an SBI officer, or if that SBI agent, or if that shooting involved a high patrolman, then that could be an event that is considered by the Sentinel Event Review Committee also. It does not exclude statewide agencies. The Sentinel Event Review Committee would choose which event, which killing, which shooting, whatever the event may be, and then start the process from there, which is why we're probably looking at, with that committee, reviewing one event per year, given the staffing and how long it takes to do that. So it's not meant to take the place of looking at every single officer-involved shooting or officer-involved killing. That has to be still handled by who's going to review that, and what law enforcement agency and what prosecutorial agency. That is not taking the place. The Sentinel Review event's not taking the place of that. And then further on the Civilian Review Board, do we want to have recommendations to counties, cities, jurisdictions for those to also happen, in addition to what other law enforcement and prosecutorial investigation there will be into any kind of event.
Mayor.
Yes, sir.
I think Representative Gallard made a good point. I haven't seen enough information to show that Citizen Review Board is even effective. And I dare say in a lot of cases, it would be easy to stack the deck, so to speak, at the local level, where they would be more in line with the decisions made by local law enforcement. But we have so many different moving parts discussing this issue. And I think the most pressing is the use of force that results in death. And you're saying there's a lack of, or seems to be a lack of public confidence when it comes to that process. But in that process, with just very few exceptions, the vast majority of agencies in this state, when use of force occurs, when use of force is used and it results in a death, the State Bureau of Investigation conducts an investigation into that shooting, and they investigate it to look to see if a crime was committed, not whether policies were violated, but whether a crime was committed. And then that information is submitted to the district attorney, like you had mentioned earlier, where the district attorney makes a decision whether to move forward or not. There are cases that are actually referred to the Attorney General's office for review as well, and can be for a number of reasons. With those processes in place, when those are submitted to grand jury, a grand jury to consider whether or not to indict, I think it's important that we look at that and take in consideration all of that information before we start suggesting something that may not be effective and may waste time in the future. Somebody mentioned a few minutes ago looking at systems overall during these processes, and maybe not every one. I think we on this task force are making a lot of progress in that area right now, in looking at systems and being able to come back and discuss that and make recommendations. So before we recommend something that may not necessarily be that effective or be redundant beyond what we have in place, I think we need to be careful because I do see where we could shore some things up, like where now it's more of a choice whether they use the State Bureau of Investigation or not. In a lot of cases, we could suggest legislation mandating that across the board. And then you have to look at when an SBI is involved, who would investigate that. But there are a lot of things to consider just beyond whether a citizen review board would be effective or a Sentinel review board would be effective for that matter. And we need information to support that moving forward, in my opinion.
Well, that's a good point. I'm coming, Ms. Perez. I think we need to probably distinguish between civilian review boards' effectiveness as the law currently exists in North Carolina, which is probably very ineffective because it's not able to review personnel files and to do certain things. And so any recommendation, I think, from this group, before it makes sense for any type of review board, it has to have the legal piece changed. And if that's something the legislator is not willing to do right now, I don't know if going down this road is effective or not. I'd be interested to review that information from a state that doesn't have the same sunshine laws and restrictions that North Carolina has, that may have civilian review boards. But I agree, it probably does need some empirical data to show if it even works or not. Ms. Perez, you had something?
I do, and forgive me, Mary, for not knowing the protocol here. As far as
this is fine. That works.
I didn't want to jump in. So just a little bit of background, and you probably saw the information that Leslie forwarded to you. I'm with NACOL. I'm the Director of Operations for NACOL. NACOL has been in existence for over 25 years. We don't set up these oversight agencies. We provide resources and training and materials for communities that are looking to create these oversight agencies. So there's various models of oversight. Some have been in existence for 35 to 40 years. Some, as you can imagine, are just being created as of late with the national conversation occurring. The different models vary from state to state for the exact same reason that you've been discussing here, because of the different laws in states with respect to the extent of authority that these oversight agencies can have within the states. And sometimes that goes towards their effectiveness in the states that they are operating in. So just a couple of points to make for your consideration. The Oversight is not intended to look at, the oversight models are not intended to look at the criminal aspects of any potential charges against officers. They do not have those authorities. Those authorities rest within the established structures under the Constitution in all states and under federal law as well. So really what the oversight agencies are looking is towards the administrative processes of how these investigations, because an officer oftentimes cannot be charged criminally, but they can be looked at administratively for violations of policies, of training, et cetera. So the oversight agency is really established as kind of the check and balance in the system to ensure that the complaints from citizens are being thoroughly and fairly looked at. There's just a couple of examples. The state of Virginia right now is looking at creating a mandate for oversight entities for the whole state. There's different cities within Virginia that are looking to create models, and they know that they're bumping up against some of the restrictions under their state law that allows them to give them some of the authority that they want. So there's legislation kind of moving through at the state level right now, where they're hoping to come to language that will at least require a minimum level of authority for these oversight agencies with no cap. In other words, to the extent that the local communities want to put that in their ordinances or city charters, that they could, if one community wants to have subpoena authority and another one doesn't, that's fine. But they're looking at their state law to ensure that to the level that they want to have authority, that they're not bumping up against any contradictions within state law. Just to give an example of something, and I know there is no anecdotal evidence to say, does having a oversight agency make a difference? I'm asked that question every day. Nicole, I should have said, oh, we only have 2 staff members. I'm one of the 2. I answer all the calls across the country every day. And that is the most common question that I get. Is it most effective? And if it is it effective? And what do you have to prove that, and which model is most effective? And realistically, it's a very hard dynamic, or a very, to be able to have data to support it is very difficult. I will point to some recent events, and like Syracuse, New York, for example. There was just an article that came out last week that the oversight agency discovered that there was, over a period of like 2 years, there was 40-some plus cases that were never investigated by the internal affairs, that the oversight agency caught because they were going back on some cases that were being sat on basically within the internal affairs office, because the assumption is that there would be a statute of limitations that would be reached, that if they didn't investigate those cases, and they would basically toll out the time, that if in fact the officers were found to be in violation of any policy, it would have been too late anyway to do any kind of discipline, because they basically sat on those cases for several years without doing investigations on it. And that is something that the oversight agency, in their work in going back and doing an audit on the cases that were coming in. So really it's that bridge, that lens, that transparency between the community and the law enforcement agency, that is essential, and it's very hard to measure. I mentioned I worked for NACO, but I was also the police auditor for the city of Tucson for 20-some years. And that was the role I played. I didn't have investigative authority. That is not the model. The model in Tucson is an auditor. And basically my role was to audit the investigations that internal affairs was doing to ensure that they were thorough, fair, consistent for both sides, not just the complainant filing the complaint, but if there was any discipline meted out, that it was also fair for the officers as well, that it was also being consistent. So there's many ways to set up these different models with various levels of authority. I use Virginia as an example because like I said, there's several large cities within Virginia that are trying to establish a model, and they are bumping up against some of the restrictions in state law that are currently being addressed. Those conversations are happening as we speak. So I don't know if that helps.
No, it helped tremendously because I think that the conversation had kind of got steered toward police shootings and whether anyone gets indicted, which, as I totally understand, this board would be more of an administrative review of whether policies were followed and those kinds of things, and leave the investigation up to the folks that do that. So I get it. Guys, this is great conversation. I have to jump off here shortly. My daughter thinks that I'm her personal butler, so I have to bring her some lunch before she goes back to class. But y'all are certainly welcome to continue on, or we can pick this up. I think we're going to have to spend some time on that, but I think we're headed down the right path with it. But I'll leave that up to you all, whether you want to continue or not.
Yeah,
I have to jump off too. I had this meeting from 10 to 12 for some reason. I don't know why.
Yes, sir. That was it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ms. Perez, I'm sure we will need you. I should have let you get in earlier, but thank you, Ms. Leslie. Thank you, Representative and Sheriff. I know you're busy, and Ms. Towns and all the team. And we'll see y'all next time. Okay.
Thanks, Mayor Coleman. And just a reminder to everybody, you'll be getting an email from me with the red line edits that you will have to approve. So once I get that out to you, if you could get that back to me, whether or not you approve, just let me know, because I'll have to respond to the task force staff about that. Thanks all.